guest. So we'd love to talk and answer your questions and explore ideas together. Tonight we're talking about cross-channel design. So let's start off with when we talk about cross-channel design, what does that mean? So there's a couple terms get thrown around. There is multi-channel design, there's cross-media design, and there's cross-channel design, sometimes omni-design or other words like that. So let's start with that. So multi-channel just means you design in multiple channels. So I've got some mobile stuff and I've got some desktop stuff and do some email stuff, and okay, that's great. Cross-media was a new one. I actually hadn't heard of that one. And it's the example was the Matrix series, where in order to fully experience the entire experience, you had to experience it across channels. So there was movie content, TV content, comic book content, web content. And in order to actually have the whole experience, you had to experience it across multiple channels. Kind of a cool idea, mostly entertainment. But the one we're going to talk about this evening is how we design guiding customers through different channels: desktop, mobile, email, phone, brick and mortar, and so on and so forth. And then we have an esteemed panel this evening to join us to talk about and explore those ideas. So why don't we start with some introductions. So Hoby, do you want to kick us off?
I know it was going to happen.
Well, you have notes, so
by virtue of my last name starting with A. So let's see, I'm Hoby Albright. I've been at CustomInk now as a design lead in the e-commerce group for just about 2 years, coming up on my anniversary. And I love it there. It's been a great experience. My role there is I sit somewhere in the triangle between brand, creative, and e-commerce. And that means a lot of developers and a lot of collaboration between a lot of disparate groups. My world exists, there's a lot of comping, a lot of talking, a lot of working through UX problems, and a lot of prototyping. Previous to CustomInk, I was at Marriott International up in Bethesda for about 4.5 years. In their UX group, and that was my first experience working client side, and that's a big client to have your first experience with. Yeah, because I showed up to work with about 3,000 people every day. It was sizable. So when I was there, I worked across 15 brands, and I was responsible for about 9 designers working there. And toward the end of my tenure there, I was served as a design lead working for our hotel website's product line. And what that meant was helping 4,000 hotel properties move from static web pages over to a responsive framework. And that was across 15 brands and supported in 6 languages. So that was fun. So I'm really happy at CustomInk.
Excellent. And talk about cross-channel design, Marriott too, right? That's another great example.
Couple things.
Yeah, just a few. Matt.
Yeah. My name is Matt Chwat. I am director of user experience for a company called ThinkGeek.com. Well, ThinkGeek is our name. We've predominantly been an e-commerce company selling geeky stuff, Star Wars, Star Trek. We also custom make product, and we now have retail stores. We were acquired by GameStop over the last summer, and we're still ThinkGeek, and we're opening ThinkGeek stores. So we have 3 stores, retail stores now, and we have our 4th opening this Friday in Manhattan. So that's our first big city location. But been at ThinkGeek for 7 years, and I run the team responsible for front-end design, new feature design, development, everything from the beginning UX and research to actual handing off JavaScript and writing JavaScript over to the engineering. Everything's done in-house. Do all our development in-house. So we have a lot of different channels. And when I hear channel, I predominantly think marketing, but that's literally, we have retail now, which is very interesting to add.
Yes, indeed. We'll get there. I'm going to skip me. I'll go last. Go ahead.
I'm Behnaz, Babazadeh. I'm here at AddThis as creative director. I run the team, the web tools team, and what that means is the web tools that we provide for like 15 million websites. There is a product there, a dashboard, analytics, and I help the marketing team and the product team keep that messaging consistent across the board.
Brooke?
My name is Brooke Falcone, and I come from a psychology background, specifically human factors. So I've been very interested in people, why they do things, what they're thinking about, both behavioral and subjective, what they say, and then also what they do. And I currently work at a company called WeddingWire. I've been there for about 3 years. WeddingWire is one of the leading online wedding marketplaces. And what that means is think like Yelp for weddings. So we serve both engaged couples as well as wedding professionals. We connect them to help engaged couples hire vendors for their wedding. And we also do wedding inspiration and guest services, registry, so the whole wedding experience. And my role there is UX researcher, and so I focus on end-to-end research, going from concept, like very early stages, what should we build, all the way through what should it look like, and then is it working as well as we expected it to, how can we improve it, iterate on it, redesign it. And we have a couple different channels that we work across. So we have a couple brands that WeddingWire has, as well as I think of channels sort of as marketing too, but also like devices. So you have tablet, smartphone, desktop, all those, maybe smartwatch soon, we'll see. So I look at all the different channels that we have and learn a little bit about how our users are experiencing our brand across all of them.
Excellent. Alex?
Alex Hsiao. I work at ETA, Emerging Technology Advisors. It's abbreviated. And if you're all drinking beer, I got some beer openers. So it's a giveaway. You don't have to join the raffle to do it, but there's only 20 of them, so fight out for it. 16 years of experience. My experience is a little bit different from the panel, which is interesting. When I spoke to Jim about this sort of collection of luminary speakers, and I was like, well, it might be interesting kind of bringing different perspectives. I come from a very consultative background. I've been working as a consultant, as an agency. I've worked with in-house designers. I've worked with agencies. I've worked with startups, Fortune 500 companies. Long story short, 16-year experience. Started with Jim, actually, back in the AOL heyday. From then on, worked my way up. Art director, left. But last 10 years, been independent consulting. Now joined a company of 20 developers, and I'm an army of one. So when I say I need some help, look to you guys, and I'd love to talk to you afterwards. One of the big things what we do is really kind of explore on the emerging technology side. We start exploring machine learning, artificial intelligence, augmented reality, the implications of what drone could do in the industry. There's the other aspect of what we do, which is consulting. We work with one of the big 4 companies, start thinking about what machine learning and artificial intelligence could do when you start opening up data and making it accessible at your fingertip. I'm just going to keep it simple for now, because I think there's some of the stuff we can start covering. So yeah, I'll just keep it short. So.
All right, excellent. And wow, it is kind of ringing. This brings down. So my name is Jim Lane. I am the now director now of user experience at Oracle, Data Cloud, and also AddThis. I've been here for AddThis for about 8 years. Before that, I was at one of Steve Case's Revolution startups. Before that, America Online, Netscape, a bunch of Silicon Valley startups before that. I'm fortunate to have Behnaz on my team, and now starting to work with designers out in the West Coast, Blue Kai, Datalogics, Crosswise, the part of the Oracle Data Cloud. So getting to meet all kinds of new people, all kinds of new things all over the place. So just really exciting for us as we were acquired recently. Which brings us back to our topic. So let's talk about cross-channel design. So probably the best place to start would be if you guys can maybe share some experiences you've had. What are some of the things just in general when we say cross-channel design in the context of your particular brand? What are some things that you've done or some interesting challenges you've faced in your particular team situation? Let's start.
Everybody go at once. Okay. I knew you were going to
We'll
get
try.
me again.
We'll just try to keep it some. I might surprise. I might surprise Alex if we go to him
Feel it
next.
coming.
So you never know where I could be.
Okay, so cross-channel. As it pertains to CustomInk, you know, in the past, you know, I've talked to my associates, and there are lots of people who've been there for a long time now, about you know, what that used to mean. And for a long period of time, you know, while the company was like growing to a substantial size, you know, there were people working on like email and catalogs and direct mail, and then some display advertising over here, and then there's the site experience itself. And so you get all these disparate things going on. Then it goes into broadcast and then radio, and you know, not to use the octopus metaphor, but I just did.
Clever.
You get all these you know, arms over there moving around and doing their things. So you know, the way to tie it all together, you know, you get to a place and all of a sudden you realize there's this big company, and then there are these silos that don't necessarily know what each other's doing. I think that you know, the challenge with cross-channel design is not just the design; it's the messaging and being able to hit the right people with the right messaging at the right place and time, especially as they're considering a purchase or learning about your brand, or whether they're in the middle of a transaction or they fell off the site and abandoned ship, and how to get them back into the funnel. So, you know, cross-channel, it's how to get those tentacles talking to each other and making sure that each is doing the most effective thing at the right time, to the right person at the right, you know, on their purchase trajectory. But you know, I would say there's more to it than just that, because you know, I think what I was talking about from that facet is really about the work that's being done and the messaging itself. But there's another side to it that's more organizational in nature, and that pertains to like, you know, the way we're doing business now internally is evolving, and we're working toward a bright, promising future where like things are much more integrated and there's much more awareness. But that comes from people having the right conversations at the right time. It comes from like organizational structures, and it also comes from leadership making it a priority and saying, you know, this is something that needs to happen within the organization, and putting those mechanisms in place to make sure that the right people are talking to each other to facilitate that work being done.
Question.
Fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that a coherent thought?
It was pretty coherent. So Matt, how do people, through what channel, if you will, do people engage with ThinkGeek? Is there a predominant one, or are there several different ways of people kind of coming into your ecosystem?
Yeah, I think now more than ever is you see people, it's like almost channel agnostic, you know, and it's so important to keep consistency, because at least I'll say design is going to change, because you're going to create solutions to solve people's problems for whatever they're doing, whether it's using a computer in front of them or a phone or walking into a store. But your message, your brand, like we said, has to be consistent, especially because right now we see people using phones. They're going to, especially our brand is very, very much so looky-loo products, you know, stuff that your friend's going to send you and share and think is really cool. And you might look at it and see it on Facebook and tap it on your phone. And then when you get home at night, you might be like, you know what, I might buy that, and get on your computer and buy that. Or you might end up seeing one of our retail stores in the future and be like, oh, I saw that on Facebook. Boom, I'm walking into the store. Our brand is very, you know, it's been really important to us. We're small, you know, we literally have 2 marketing designers, one, you know, head marketing designer who's doing display advertising for Facebook. But he's also doing the catalog, and he's also helping create banners for the website, and also retail store graphics. So brand messaging for us is important to keep consistent, and that's our voice, you know, how we speak, which has been a big challenge to get in writing because it's very tribal knowledge coming from people who've been at the company for a long time. So that's getting that stuff down and understanding what message you're trying to keep consistent or what brand or design you're trying to keep consistent throughout your channels. And when you actually interact with customers or users is important for us at the start. But channels for us, at least from what we're talking about and the way people interact with our store or e-commerce, is so fluid because they, like I said, they're using all sorts of different ones before they end up making a purchase or even after they make a purchase because they want to share it, or they're looking at us on Twitter at some funny stuff that we post. So it's all over, and it's very important for us to keep the brand consistency.
Gotcha.
Because the design will evolve and change. The actual UI, the interface will change over time, but the brand and that voice doesn't.
That's a great point.
Yep. On AddThis, I guess we tend to be a little more focused on how people discover us. You want to talk a little bit about how people kind of come into our ecosystem?
Yeah, so we have a lot of our organic traffic coming just from our tools being around the web. You know, they see our tools on a website that they use often and want it for their own website. So they research and get to our website. But that's not the only way that they discover us. You know, we're also doing some advertising. We're also reaching out to the social community and trying to be a voice in the social community. So there may be other channels that they're discovering us through. But as far as being a cross-channel brand, I think we've got a lot more to do there. What we've been focused on at the moment is just trying to keep that experience consistent and keep that messaging consistent. I think to be truly cross-channel, you need to give an experience that like almost handholds from one place to the next. So like Netflix is a great example of a brand that you watch something and you leave, you come back, you can start off the video right where you left it. We tend to like if you, for example, are in the middle of configuring a tool within our dashboard and leave, well, you at the moment like you have to go and discuss, like pull it up again and continue working on it. So there are some behavior there that we can work on as a brand, but that is really where we are with things.
Okay. Excellent. And I'm gonna, in a question or two, I'm gonna come back to kind of that thread of how each of you follows a customer through kind of these experiences. We'll come back to that though. So Brooke, tell us a little bit about WeddingWire and some of the things that you guys do, and what does your kind of experience, your ecosystem kind of look like?
So we have several different touch points where users can hear of WeddingWire. One being our website. You can search something like wedding venues in Washington, D.C., and you might stumble on WeddingWire. Or maybe you attended a friend's wedding and you hear that we have a guest app. So as a participant in a wedding, you may actually hear about WeddingWire because you're taking pictures and you want to upload them to the couple who you're taking them of. Or maybe you go to a bridal show and you actually see our booth and learn about WeddingWire that way. So there's many different ways that WeddingWire gets, and this is just purely engaged couples, the vendors, that's a whole nother conversation. But one of the challenges that we've actually faced is identifying who is who across different channels. So it's a good question about, well, where was the first place that you heard about WeddingWire? And it's tough to rely on their memory, as many of you probably know. When you do research, you ask people questions and they have no idea. They either make up an answer, they tell you an incorrect answer. So it's tough to rely on just their memory of that. So what we've been trying to do is track users across our different channels. And that becomes challenging because we have a non-auth experience and we don't necessarily know who's who, and we have non-auth, both mobile So mobile web, we have desktop, and then we have a non-auth app experience as well. So you can actually use our app and have never signed up with WeddingWire. So we want people to register, but as I'm sure also you guys know that it's tough to get people to register. That's a perceived barrier or an actual barrier that they have to overcome to actually become part of your community. And that's been something we've been working towards, because we know that people experience us first as a non-auth user and then become auth, and then maybe non-auth users and auth users differ in some very strategic way. Obviously, they're becoming auth for a reason. So maybe they're doing different things, you know, when they're auth or non-auth. So yeah, we've been trying to learn about that and focus on that. And that's how one way we track people across our different channels. So then we can send them emails once we have their email address and actually talk to them that way, re-engage them, things like that. So yeah, that's one thing that we've been thinking about recently.
That was actually a really big challenge for us early on with AddThis. We didn't require registration. And it actually allowed us in a lot of ways to win very early, because we were just on millions and millions of websites. Years later, though, you realize, well, there's no way to know there's millions of people out there using our tools on their websites, and we have no idea who they are and no way to find out. So it's a real challenge to connect those dots. Alex, there's so many things I could ask you about, man. There's Mod Wedding, there's ETA, there's all the brands that you've worked with. So maybe just pick one and tell us a little bit about how you guys have approached a kind of cross-channel user experience.
Sure. It's funny, Behnaz, you mentioned Netflix. I worked with Netflix for about 6 months working on the R&D. Got a really good chance, a strong chance to look in the inside and kind of peer in the hood and say, how do you guys actually create great experiences? And exactly the same thing. The experience needs to be continuous all throughout. So I think we touched on brand. We talked about continuous messaging. And I think if you really think about it from a product perspective, there's always a sense about a business goal. So if you start qualifying metrics, so any product you work on, whether it be a website, whether it be an app, you start qualifying metrics. What qualifies as success? And one of the big things that when I was there was really looking at, the one metrics was just time consumed. That was it. It wasn't about clicks. It was about click-throughs. It wasn't about how many videos was being clicked. Now, all that is being measured. Granted, everything you do on Netflix, I guarantee, is being tracked. However, with that said, continuous testing is being taken place, but the one goal for success was about time view. So I had a privilege in working with some really great designers that worked on the mobile application, that worked on the desktop application, that worked on the tablets, that worked on various different desktop setup devices, from Roku to Amazon Fire to Apple TV. In fact, the Apple TV was just coming out. They had it in the locked room. They wouldn't let me see it, but it was cool. But they let me work on touch interfaces. So I was working on Connect, gestural interfaces. So if you start thinking about how do you make that experience good, well, the cross-channel experience is making sure that, well, you have a common goal, time view. Let's make sure the users are going in and watching and consuming. Make it easy to discover, making it so that people can go through, preview, see it, and get to that video play. Now they can go in and hopefully you can help and create an experience that they're able for them to come back out quickly or be able to get to the next video quickly. So as you can see, it's one objective as creatives, and I'm sure as developers. How many developers are here? I'm curious about that.
Great question.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm not gonna bastardize myself too much because I work with a lot of developers. I'm supposed to say we worked on Node.js, React, and containers. I don't know if that rings a bell. But common goals, right? Messaging goal. But I think if you can work around the goal and you start applying across channels, like obviously we all are as creatives, you understand the restricted nature of devices on mobile. You understand about the horizontal swiping versus vertical swiping on tablets to mobile. You also understand from desktop, it's a click interface, while you have surfaces now and touch interfaces. But you can see that the application, how people interact is one way, but also how you message it too, in terms of how you're actually conveying that message. So from the interface perspective, you're gonna look at it from the standpoint of how they consume. From a brand and messaging standpoint, you're also gonna understand their attention span. How you channel through messaging, through social media, across from one channel from Snapchat, right? Your audience is gonna also be very critical. You're talking to millennials. And as how you message on Facebook is also gonna be distinctively different. So I think with Netflix, it was a collective effort. Across the board, the designers were always on board. There was always a business product manager, but it was a very structured format where there was a common goal. There were assumptions are being made and constantly being made and constantly being tested. There were no such thing as bad ideas, because any prototypes you come up, you'll go through a sprint process. It'll be validated very quickly. And you guys are constantly being tested on Netflix, whether you know it or not. But that's how they prove it. Let the data prove itself. So I think, how do you validate cross-channel? I know we haven't gotten there, but that's a good way to do it. Of course, in the US research standpoint, you probably tested that. I'm sure the panels will probably speak to that. So at Netflix, a lot of the thing was, how do you cross and maintain that cross sort of platform consistency from design, whether it be color, whether it be UI patterns. Pattern library is a great tool. Should definitely look into that. But it just making sure I have that consistency across the board. So yeah, cool.
So listening to you guys, there's a couple things I'm going to want to touch on. I want to talk more about identity management across channels, how we're measuring things across channels, which would be really cool to dig into a little bit. Maybe how voice or other things change between channels, and actually you touched on structuring your org. How do we organize teams to be able to successfully work across different channels? But before we go there, let's go to the audience. Do you guys so far have any questions for any of us? Go ahead, shoot.
I have a question. A lot of the time, or most of the conversation here has been based around a lot of the web products, maybe brick and mortar, some mobile applications. But I think successful businesses today need to understand both software development and hardware development, and how to integrate both of those things together. The reason why Google bought Nest is sort of a good example, even though it sort of has some bad news in the media today. Regardless of that, that's sort of an example of a hardware, software integration type company. Thinking of that type of company, how would you think about cross-channel in terms of moving towards being successful and using your product in that sort of way?
So I'm going to ask the question back, so for our friends on the internet can hear with the mics, and I want to make sure I get it right. So are you asking for a company that's more hardware oriented instead of software or brick and mortar? Does that change the approach as far as question? Is that kind of the question you're asking?
Yeah, I guess I'm asking, the conversation is sort of been around more software based,
Sure.
Except for the mobile device. I'm sort of asking, is there an opinion, or can we talk about a little bit where the internet sort of jumps out of the glass panel and into the world of reality, and how that would affect cross-channel?
So maybe even like a John Deere or something, like who's like a serious hardware.
Even Nest itself, it's inherently cross-channel.
Sure.
You buy the product to have this physical piece of hardware that sits in your house, makes your life better, lowers your bills, but you can use your phone with it. So you know that you're going to be using that product cross-channel, or what we're calling cross-channel here. You know you're going to be using it that way. So I feel like, from my perspective as a designer, is that I actually am envious of it, because it's almost like sandboxed. It's like if I told you only could use Google Chrome to access my website, and you were like, cool, I'm into it. Because Nest, you're literally buying into it. I'm going to use it. We make software that works on this device or this operating system, and we have this piece of hardware that goes with it. And it's the collective experience of using all of it together that makes that product, captivating to somebody or enticing to buy that product. It'll make your life better. I like my phone. I can use it. I can use my Nest. I can change my temperature. I can see those things. Same thing with smart home products. anything like that. Stuff we sold that stuff. I think all those things can be thought of and almost crafted much better experiences than us trying to like scramble to make sure that we're like covering everybody who's interacting with our brands and using our products, whatever they might be, websites or stores.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to jump in?
Sure. So, hey, David.
Good to see you, by the way.
I don't think this will address your question, but in terms of like making the leap into like the real world, at CustomInk, the users are interacting with our design lab and selecting products, and that does have to go through a real world translation. At some point, ink hits fabric and gets into a box and comes to a place, and there is an unboxing experience. And when people open those boxes and experience the joy or emotion that's wrapped around distributing those shirts, and they're like, this came out exactly the way that I hoped it would. In fact, it's even better. And to see everybody's like reaction and come together collectively and coalesce as a group and have an experience, it's not a device that's sticking on a wall, but there is a hard real world translation that also has a good bit of emotion attached to it and some dependency that comes out right and on time for an event. So
I think that's a good point, though, except when the thing that you're wearing becomes active or a wearable, connected to the internet somehow in one way or another. And then how does that...
We don't have that ink yet.
We're working on it.
Good upsell opportunity.
How does a thing that's connected to the internet, an actual physical object, impact the design of the software? And how do the teams then sort of negotiate from a hardware design standpoint and a software design, and how those teams kind of work together?
I tried, man. I tried really hard.
I'm not sure it's that much different. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's where research is like super vital, right? Like that's when your research team should be documenting very meticulously, like how are people interacting with the product in the physical space. So like Fitbit is something that we're all familiar with. It's a wearable. And I'm sure many of you guys know or are a Fitbit user, and and like me, seeing someone who does wear a Fitbit, I can just tell like how connected they've become to the device, and now they've connected to the app as well, and they're one and the same almost. Like they need that feedback, they need to know that it's responding to them, and there is that commitment that grows that ties them to that workout routine. So I think as a research team, the more you can watch your user in all of these different spaces, you can better gauge like what problems are they having. At what point can we make that experience just a little bit easier, right? So they give you that little bit of feedback right on the device rather than you having to pull out your phone. Well, that's something that may not have been in the initial prototype, right? That could have been something that they were like, oh, well, people keep looking at that, hoping to see some sort of feedback. So I think that's where the research is really important with like physical devices.
Yeah. And talk about a channel that's transformed.
Yeah.
The wearables has transformed healthcare. My job before AddThis was Revolution Health, and we were focusing on fixing healthcare. Noble endeavor. But at the time, 10 years ago, people really weren't ready to think about managing their health, but wearables completely changed that, which is really interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
So with that in mind, if we were to push it out 5 years, what should we as UX designers be excited about in 5 years?
Can I take that?
Absolutely.
All right.
Talk about a softball.
Right. So when we start, I was going to jump in about the hardware aspects. You're really starting to talk about industrial design, which unfortunately none of us, I can't speak for all this, but I don't. But as you start thinking about how it ties it over to the digital world, in terms of an emergent standpoint, there is a lot of factors. You start looking at conversational experiences. When you start thinking about echoes and the ability to be able to talk to a machine or artificial intelligence, how that conversates back in terms of the tone in terms of the pacing, in terms of the message, is certainly something I think as designers, we're gonna have to start looking out for. When you start getting into virtual reality, how does the atmospheric experience sort of come into play? You're no longer just dealing with two senses, the sight and the touch. You're starting to deal with a lot more into the foray, into how you start crafting the experience in a sort of alternate or virtual reality. How you essentially pan and position the camera in terms of your point of view, whether or not it should be moving or not moving, depending whether or not your field of view is moving or not. It's certainly going to be something we're going to start looking into. You're almost kind of like, as a designer, you start looking at almost like as a director. When you start thinking about, I can start print anything, right? You start talking, that touches a little bit of hardware. We're actually in control of creating and crafting physical, actual, real goods. So that's also something to think about. You start talking about pattern recognitions and machine learning. As researchers, as analysts, and as designers, I would implicate how that data comes back and how you want to decipher that, and also to showcase the data. The data visualization, I think, is going to continue to be very, very strong in terms of what we could do. So just touching on some of those. Yep.
Cool.
Yeah.
What else do you guys think is exciting in the space? Anything else jump to mind?
I think the data to me is super exciting. The data share of just learning about people and how you can take data about any attribute about a person or a product and connect people with different things. Whether for me it's product, it's sharing of information and data between what people to help just like craft better experiences of going into a store or going into a restaurant. And you've been there maybe one time, but the waiter knows that you're allergic to what you're allergic to, and he tells you by your name because you just walked into the store. Those things happen. They're, like we have beacons and those things exist, but they're not used they are, but they're not used as widely as for some of those things. There's also a little creepiness factor.
Yeah.
It's a gentle
Yeah,
dance.
it's a very gentle dance.
Minority Report, where he's walking through and the walls are talking to him.
Yeah, the virtual reality it's interesting to me too as well, because I did the Valve, the Steam Valve virtual reality when I was out at a GameStop's conference last fall, and there's a physical reaction you can have to that stuff. So like, I mean, it literally, you're immersed. It's not just like you sit there. You can watch a video and something pops out and you get scared. You're literally sitting in front of these things and you feel like I had a floor. I was in Portal. I was in like Aperture Laboratories, and it was insane. Like the floor starts dropping out, and I literally am like, my heart. I'm afraid of heights.
You okay?
I'm freaking out. So like, but I've had conversations with people like the guy who heads up licensing for Valve. Awesome dude, and he would say that he would have to actually almost like people on bad trips, like help them out of it. Like he was telling stories of like, he's like, my office is where they come afterward, and I just kind of walk them back into reality. But there's a physical reaction you're having to a digital experience that we can create ourselves.
Yeah, there's been a lot of buzz. I just looked them up really quickly. Magic Leap.
Yep.
Which is augmented reality instead of virtual reality. So
if anyone can get their hands out, let me know.
Yeah, seriously. Seriously. So I could be sitting at this table and suddenly there's a keyboard here and then it comes up like this and it's just within the world. Yeah. We're getting a little off topic, but go ahead, shoot.
Yeah, I had a question. I had mentioned like talking about keeping the brand consistent across all the channels. And you have like a branding guideline or sort of the head of branding who deals with, from print all the way through on all the different channels.
It's a great question. Yeah. It's a great question, and I think I said it in the beginning. It's a challenge, and for us, we've been lucky to be small enough, and a lot of the people have been there for a while. It's kind of tribal knowledge, which is a little scary for some things like voice. You got to get that stuff down. It's important just as much as KPIs, like to get those things set in stone, to know what your goals are. But it's shared across, predominantly marketing. We went through a rebranding of our company a few years ago, and alongside of that was defining this stuff. So we laid it all out, and we have brand guidelines. We have basics around how we talk and how ThinkGeek speaks to customers and what that means. And those things are used. So for instance, GameStop they pop up the shops for us. They're building retail stores. So we supply brand information to their team that is doing this. We also had them come in, the people who are going to hire store managers, associates, and we worked with them to come up with ideas on how to incorporate our culture and our voice from a digital experience into a retail experience. So that means, how do we, store associates can dress, almost the GameStop associates are envious of ThinkGeek associates because they're way more lenient at ThinkGeek, and you get it's just, that's how our culture is. And we wanted to integrate that in so you have that experience when you talk to somebody that they're excited about Game of Thrones episode that they watched last week, and they'll talk to you about it because that's what we encourage, part of our brand.
So I can hop in a little bit on this, if it's okay. The tricky thing with brand guidelines is that sometimes they can be restrictive. And when you're talking to people through broadcast or radio or display advertising or your site experience or catalogs, all these different things communicate in different ways in order to be effective. So a brand guideline can be, if it's overly restrictive, it can also be a set of handcuffs that kind of like holds those things back. I think that there's a sweet spot to find brand guidelines that are flexible enough to allow those things to do what's best for those different points, those different touch points with consumers. But it's a sweet spot, and it takes an organization that understands what that flexibility is, because everybody sees the brand through their own set of eyes and their unique perspective and their own utility for using those things. So it's a dance. It's tricky, but it exists. It's an evolving thing, especially as an organization grows, to make sure that the brand guidelines are evolving with the organization to serve the needs of all the entities that are consuming it.
So I want to come back to identity and connecting some of those dots together. And Brooke, you brought this up, how you guys have folks coming in who may not register, who you don't necessarily know closely, or people that you might. So I want to start with you and then talk to a few others of how do you, when someone kind of enters your world, how do you get to know who they are? And then how do you guide them through your own particular experience in whatever channels that entails? So how do you I don't use the word track, but sure. Stock, that's a good one. How do you connect those dots?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess my first thought is we've been leaning towards personalization, which is something that we've been working towards. And you have to wonder, like, what is the line there, and where you don't want to stalk them, but people are becoming to actually beginning to expect some level of personalization, recommendations, for example. When you land on a page, like, do we predict what you want based on what you've done previously? So we've tried to guide people by, when they sign up with us, they tell us a little bit about themselves. And we use that to guide other sections of our site. For example, if we know that you have a venue selected, then we'll start recommending, okay, now it's time to find your photographer, because we know that's the next thing, that's the next vendor that you're actually going to have to book. So in some ways, we become the expert, and we're the wedding planning expert, and we're telling you who it's probably your first time planning a wedding, maybe not, but we're helping you make decisions and saying, okay, you've never done this before. Let us help you to some extent know what you have to do next and know what you should be doing. Another place where we can actually guide people is, what conversation should you be having with wedding vendors, for example, because you don't know what to ask. And when we were talking about virtual reality, like maybe you have people who want to meet their vendors online, and that could be an interesting next generation. But that's where actually research comes in, where you start saying, well, is that something that you want to make digital? So you're wondering, is that the correct channel for that level of communication? Or maybe you facilitate something else, like an in-person conversation. But yeah, WeddingWire, we've been thinking a lot about how to personalize our products without being, or also without requiring a lot of input from you. So it's taxing to ask consumers 100 different questions in order. So how can we collect information from them without requiring them to just answer a survey or answer a quiz? How can we tell things about them and collect that without input from them? And that's tricky. That's something that we've been thinking a lot about and trying to make work. For example, if we know your budget, maybe we can filter for you when you get to a page where filtering is required. We can take that step for you and make it a little easier for you. Yeah, so that's I guess to some extent what we're doing.
And I have a follow-up question, and it would have been an awesome one to also ask Keith. Now, Keith Dufresne, you might have seen in the meeting. He couldn't be here tonight. He's actually stuck on a plane. Bummer. But he was VP of UX at Living Social, and the same question would have been interesting to him. Do you guys extend your brand to a vendor? So if I want to plan a wedding, I come and work with you guys. You guys recommend a florist. You recommend whoever.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm engaging with the vendors that you're recommending, does your brand extend into that relationship? Or do you guys feel like you would want it to, or how?
What do you mean by that exactly?
So you have I say I want flowers for my event. You
Mhm.
recommend a florist. Is there any extension of WeddingWire into the relationship I have with that florist? Is there a connection there, or do you guys feel like the relationship I have with that vendor comes back to my relationship with you?
So right now we don't extend past that. What our metric is connecting the two and finding a really good fit. So we solve the need for the vendor where we're helping them find engaged couples, and then solving the need for the couples, helping them find vendors. So right now, no, we're not extending past that, but yeah, potentially there's so many steps that come after that yeah, you could absolutely predict that might happen at some point.
I have another question. Do you see how good an experience somebody had with a vendor affect their interactions with your brand post that? So like, let's say I get a florist connected to me and it was horrible. And I'm like, well, WeddingWire hooked me up with that florist. I'm not going back there. I'm going to go somewhere else to find it. Is that something that you guys think about, or?
Absolutely. That's absolutely something that we hear through user research all of the time. Yeah, people associate all of our vendors with the company, and that can be tricky because each vendor is unique and they are their own company and their own brand, and yet they represent us to a certain extent, or they're associated with us to a certain extent. So yeah, that's definitely something we have to think about. Vendors, they make their own storefront on our site and they have creative freedom there. So that's a challenge, like releasing the creative freedom to them at this point and saying, well, what they do represents us. And you see that users land on a storefront and let's say they don't like what they see. They say, wow, they associate with WeddingWire immediately, or they love it and they love the storefront, they love the vendor. They say, WeddingWire is amazing. I'm going to continue looking for different vendors. So yeah, absolutely.
So Hoby, I've NoVA UX has done t-shirts with CustomInk, so I've kind of had that experience. When someone comes to you guys and does a t-shirt, has it fulfilled, that's kind of a beginning for you, right? There's a kind of an ongoing relationship. How do you guys follow customers through different channels and parts of the relationship?
There are a couple different ways. One of them happens kind of beautifully and organically just by virtue of the nature of the purchase, because it's distributed. Just you as a group organizer are making a purchase, and it could be X number of t-shirts, and you're going to distribute those, and we make sure that everything's got a hang tag on it, and it's a cool little sticker, and there's some scattered around over there, and those things get stuck all over the place, and there's a little social opportunity there. The box is very recognizable, and we really rely on a tremendous amount of our business is through word of mouth. Because it spreads out. One of the things we're starting to recognize and act against is communicating a little bit differently to the group organizers, and then the group participants, and then outside of that, there's another circle of people who are supporters of the group that's happening, or you know, looking to achieve a cause, or whatever it is. There's always this extra ring of people who are involved in some tangential way. We do a lot of email follow-ups and communicating with people who may have come to the lab, had an experience, begun to create something, and then fallen off. And you know, it's timed. It's not instant. It's like, hey, where'd you go? You know, we time it appropriately and make sure that the communication is appropriate, so it's not weird, and that it's the correct tone of voice.
Cool.
Ask a follow-up question on it?
Yeah. What's that?
So I don't know if you guys are still doing it, but I came to your site one time and there was a chat function where you could chat with the representative.
Yes.
How does that fit into? I mean, is it are you like coaching the people that are taking those calls? Or?
Absolutely. It's actually, you know, throwing up a chat platform is remarkably complicated. You know, my involvement, I got to work with the UX team that was involved in testing that and sorting out. It's not just like buying something off the shelf and stick it there. There's a lot of figuring out which one is the right fit, making sure everybody who's fulfilling those chats on the back end is responding in the appropriate way, making sure that we're staffed appropriately to handle the influx of people engaging in that way, and then also measuring it intensively to figure out what learnings we can get from that and how to apply that to improving the business. The appetite for chat was pretty significant, and we got a great deal of learning from it. And so all that's being rolled up into, you know, finalizing a vendor relationship and figuring out how to implement that in the future.
Which makes a lot of sense because it's a relatively sophisticated transaction ultimately to order like a large number of t-shirts.
Right.
Like, there's a lot of decisions to make.
And there's also, you know, the difference between chat engagement on desktop and then chat engagement here. You know, you're holding a device that's originally intended to make a phone call. So
How about that?
what do? Do you offer it? Do you not? How much do you interfere with your with the UI and interrupt that and say, hey, here's a chat here? Or do you downplay it? I mean, there's a lot of nuance there. Push pull.
Great. I want to ask about measurement, maybe Behnaz a little bit, but before we go there, any other questions? Go ahead.
I understand you don't want to necessarily go ahead and have 100 questions for every user. And this could be across anybody in the panel. But what about inviting people who might be interested in having a more defined experience and invite them and say, hey, you know, we can better serve you by asking a number of questions. You'd like to take a short survey or a more detailed survey. How would that otherwise fit into possibly being able to tailor, at least offering as an option, to be able to tailor that response to and give them an appropriate user experience or response to what they're looking for. And obviously, I kind of flip off of you, but it could be almost anybody.
So, so maybe active versus passive information gathering. What do you guys, what's
offer active as an option?
as an option? What do you guys think?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you asked that because we've been doing some testing around that. And we have found that, as you alluded to, if you tell users why they're doing something, they're much more likely to do it. So if you tell them your results will be improved or your experience will be improved by giving us a small amount of information, they're much more likely to do it. And I think there's a psychology portion of this too, which is sunk cost. If you get them to do a little something and then ask them, hey, do you want to keep going? Like, how that wasn't so bad, right? You know, and you're already halfway there, you know, they're much more likely to continue giving you more information. And yeah, I think that that's definitely the case. I think that's a great point.
I would also like to add context is also a good point in terms of where, in terms of the flow, it might be a checkout flow. Hopefully you're not asking survey at checkouts. But if you think about a particular action they're doing, be like, hey, it looks like you're trying to search. Hey, let us ask you a couple of questions about search. So at this point, you actually have a better context and a better result at that particular junction in terms of the user's action. So that's always helpful.
Like Clippy.
Yeah.
At CustomInk, one of the things we've done recently as a test is we've got hundreds of products and beyond T-shirts and a lot of different audiences, many different kinds of users. So we've got this very complicated, like many-to-many thing, many-to-many relationship. So in order to help users kind of like self-identify, we offer like a couple different calls to action. One is to get started designing, because you might have your concept in mind and you've got a preconceived notion. You want to get into the lab and start creating something. Other people might have a logo or identity or a piece of art that's already set, but they need to go find a product and sort through that experience, which we're actively working on optimizing and making that a lot cleaner for our users. But one of the things we've done is offered users like a really simple questions like, hey, tell us what size group you're designing for, or tell us, that's like one way of doing it. Or how many items are you interested in? Is it 1 to 5 or is it 6 and up? And that way, because of the nature of the printing business that we're in, some of the products you have to have a certain quantity in order to print. So that way you can kind of like self-select, but keep it very conversational and human, and then drop them into a product selection that's already pre-filtered. So they're not going through things and faced with the disappointments like, well, I want this one, but I didn't realize I needed to buy 100 of them. So you can filter out and say, all right, these ones you can get 1 to 5 pieces, but if it's 6 and above, then you go over here. It's a simple way of kind of like slicing an audience in half.
Gotcha. You had a question.
Yeah, I found it interesting that when you were talking about rolling out that effort of the chat service within the site, you talked about working with the user experience team to like give direction to that effort while rolling it out, but didn't mention the customer service or the customer success team. And I wonder like why was it the user experience design team instead of the customer success team?
So that's an oversight on my part, and I'm sorry if there's a misunderstanding. There's a tremendous amount of training with customer support and the people who are actually on the other side of that responding to it. User experience is just responsible for like the implementation of the tool and the visual presentation of it to make sure that it's on brand and behaving properly and working across devices and experiences. But there's tremendous integration with the business and the support side.
Yeah, to go along with what you were saying, because we do, chat. It's very empathetic to what you're saying. You can the UX from a site perspective. There is CS. We train people how they talk to people in chat. How many chats concurrently are good to have at the same time? What type of voice, tone of voice, be personable with that? What accommodations they can give people? All that stuff plays in. What I think what we're talking about from a UX perspective is, I'll give you an example. If somebody clicks the chat box and it shows them that they've got a 25-minute queue because an agent forgot to log out and we didn't accommodate for that, we might have lost a purchase. Versus we could have accommodated for it by, there might have been a bug or something, or like handling it differently, a different screen, or telling it, let's say time was off and we didn't have things to schedule showing the chat, when to show the chat, when not to show the chat. What does it say? Does it say it's available? Does it say unavailable? Do you just hide it? Do you keep it on the screen? Are people going to find it if you hide it when they're off? Those are the type of kind of questions I think as
UX
considerations for implementation of a chat from an e-commerce perspective, especially because really we're focused on conversion and everything. We're people making purchases on our site of our product and us connecting them to product that they really want to create relationships. And all these things are trying to ease that process of us connect or make them shorter or like connect them faster with that.
So
does that answer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
So let's talk about measurement. And Behnaz, I'm going to start with you. So we have people having these experiences, digital, phone, maybe chatting, calling, walking into a brick and mortar store. so on and so forth, emails on our side, digital things. What are some strategies for measuring how are people moving through and between these channels? We'll start with AddThis and maybe talk to some other guys about how you guys do it.
Yeah, so we're primarily digital. So a lot of our communication is like, how are they doing within the funnel experience, like the whole onboarding experience, the first time experience. Are they returning to our dashboard? Like, are they coming back to get more tools? Are they checking in and seeing their analytics? And we've had a huge effort on the marketing side of the house to improve our email communication across the board so that we are constantly checking in on them, and also being good about providing information outside of just how their tools are doing, but also on how to be a better marketer and how to get the most of being a social media expert. And as far as measuring, we have KISS metrics and GA in place to see where people are having challenges. I think more importantly, when we do user testing around a specific task or area of weakness, that's when we get the most insight into what are the challenges that they're having, how can we improve it, are there any sort of notifications we can do. So we've implemented notifications in the dashboard to help continue that conversation with the customer. It's all of these like little plug and play touch points that you can do to help tie that across their experience with your product. It's not just like they come and they're gonna grab the tool and then they're good to go. We want to make sure that they're happy and they're constantly engaged, and that's how to make the best of the experience.
Gotcha. Anybody else? Tools, some strategies that you guys use to?
I mean, I will say AddThis can track people across all sorts of different devices.
Yeah.
That's true.
And that is a solution that I've looked at in the past of being able to tell, lookalikes or what people, what your interests are outside of just our site, because that is something we would try.
Yeah.
It's really difficult across different things for us. It's logged in users. You really are the way you're going to be able to track somebody across different devices for us, unless we were to go to something like, like I was talking about earlier with these guys around Adobe, Adobe Marketing Cloud. We use Omniture or Adobe Analytics, they call it. It's and they have a new thing that they just announced, which is a co-op where different companies who are using Adobe can opt into this co-op and share data. So if you were to, I was using the example, let's say American Airlines goes in and says we want to be the co-op, and we say we're in the co-op. If a customer of ours goes on their site, they're going to know, and same vice versa. Those types of things, we could trade that information or cross. I guess at that point, the device is really logged in for us. No one outside of having OS, like Twitter's doing it, Facebook's doing it. Those guys are doing it because you log in at the OS level, and they can actually then track you across your experience, like desktop. I'm logged in on my iPad, on my iPhone, and my computer, and I can see. They literally can see all that. They can track where your first touch is with interaction, where your last touch is, and how many interactions it took you to get there. How many times you jump back and forth between the desktop and mobile phone. That's the stuff I'm really interested in for our customers. But it's really hard for us to find out unless you're logged in on every device on our site.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges we've had is, even though we know a lot about you and like you put our tools on your site, we know based on some keywords that it's, let's say, a travel website. But we don't know if it's like you're giving travel tips or you actually selling tickets. Like we don't know specifically what you're doing for your site. So we can't tailor the messaging that much. But we do have that on our minds. Just on a general basis, how can we use the learning that we do have and how to use that better?
That's been one of the really interesting things, is because we're fortunate to be able to see people all over the world. So the first time someone comes to a site like Home Depot, Home Depot knows nothing about me. But AddThis, we can help them understand that actually we've seen Jim all over the internet, and we can tell you actually a lot about Jim, even though Jim's never been there before, which is
That's
the
true.
cold start problem. How about you guys? How do you guys kind of trace people through the
I'll be very
experience?
cautious, being the designer speaking out of school about measurement and analytics. What the comment I can make is that all the different channels that we have communicating out to users, the nature of the data that they bring back is different. And so everything's tracked very separately and coalesced in the larger picture by people more intelligent than myself. But it's a challenge that continues to evolve.
I mean, yeah, it's a little, we have people who, I work very closely with analytics, and it's outside my world, but they're like crisscrossing that data with census data to look at. It's a lot of customer insights for us to understand our customer, to know that, you know, for us, that if we can get somebody to purchase outside of holiday, like Christmas time, that's amazing. We have increased their value over their lifetime a ton, because the majority of our purchases are happening one time only during the holiday time.
Right.
So customer insights, and we see really that data feeding more into marketing from that perspective than it does, I guess, into feedback for user experience, I guess, for channel design.
And we could do a whole separate panel on data and privacy and how do you strike that balance between value, and it's huge. It's super important to us, obviously. Let's go back to the audience here. Do you guys have more questions for the group up here? Sure.
I would actually like to know like name of tools you actually use. So like, do any of you use something like Intercom.io?
Yep. That's a great tool.
Like, we all have the same questions. You all are struggling with the same issue, but what tools do you use to try to answer those questions?
Yep. So far, we've heard Kissmetrics, Google Analytics. How about you guys?
I have kind of a peripheral answer to that, which is you could ask users. So primary research is a tool to get at that, which does not track the user. It's actually asking them, so what are you using? And you can learn not only the different channels that they're using within your brand, but also other brands that maybe they have supplemental sites or apps that they're using in combination with your brand. And what primary research adds that these other analytics tools may not is the why. And I think that's really, really important to talk about and think about is why are you using an app versus why are you using a desktop? Why are you talking to the customer care reps, and why are you not going to the knowledge base that you have online or you may have set up? And that gives you a lot of information about where you should be looking forward in the future, what different interactions or experiences you can specialize your different channels for. So customer care reps, something that they do that a knowledge base or AI robot, response lady might not, is they're human, right? They can empathize, they can, so maybe that's what you specialize that channel for. Mobile, we know that people are typically doing that because they're bored or they're on the go. So you can harness what you know about mobile and use that to make that specific channel better. And then desktop, they make a lot of their big riskier decisions there, make a lot of their buying there. They do creative work on their desktop. So you can maybe use that in some way too. So primary research, I think, is really important. And you learn not only within your brand, but also the whole picture, the holistic experience that your user is actually going through.
I think that's a great point. That really then helps inform in terms of type of tools, the type of data you're looking for. But to answer your question, mixed panel is also another good one where you can start setting up funnels and start understanding where the drops is happening in terms of your buy flow or in terms of the path you're trying to determine and having the users to go to. But I would say actually having preconceptions of knowing what the intended results that you want it to be would then help inform, because I think a lot of data analytics is really forensics. You're looking at the history. And really what you want to do is be able to say, okay, I can take this history and start making it into an action or a future, if you will, right? Something that can dictate and actually transform and change, do it in from a standpoint, whether it be conversion, revenue, signups and so forth. So, yeah.
There are tools that are doing, like they're moving towards it. I
Mhm.
can tell you that like Adobe, in terms of their testing software, Target, to test and target, a lot of the newer stuff that they're pushing towards is around automation. So they're learning about people and they want to then dynamically serve the best performance things, content to them, or the best experiences to create a test. It's like automated learning, predictive, being able to predict it and going forward. So for us, it's Adobe, but I mean, Google, there's a lot of free tools out there, especially Google Analytics is super powerful in terms of what you can do for free and how far you can take it. It just, I mean, Google articles. Like,
A lot of customization.
A lot of customization. It can go as deep as you want it to go.
Yeah.
So everything else outside of that, like I could say to you, Marketing Cloud, but we spend a ton of money. Like it's expensive. These tools are very expensive. So for somebody who maybe wants to jump into it, it's you go look for the things that are free and you go read articles and figure out, hack it up and figure out how to do it and answer the questions that you're trying to answer. But you got to figure out what that question is or that hypothesis is that you're trying to prove first, going back to that. And that will then help you dictate how you then answer that question.
Yep. I'd also add a lot of email platforms that you use to send out emails can measure things like open rate, click rate, and things like that to really understand when you're sending out communications, how people are engaging with those communications. And you can do testing and tie it back to site cookies and things like that. So there's other methods like that.
We funnel that data directly back in to then be able to tell the effects of what happens when they come in, when we drive them. So they click through, great click-through rate, but they landed on a landing page that was horrible.
Yep.
So like those types of things, you want to be able to connect those dots as well.
So my last question to the table, I'm gonna give you guys a preview of it, and then I'm gonna take questions from these guys, and then I'll come back to you guys. My last question to you guys is gonna be, what do you think the most important challenge or the most exciting thing about this kind of idea of designing experiences across these different kinds of channels is? But before we all answer that, any other questions from you guys while these guys noodle on my last? Yeah, go ahead.
Follow-on question. You talked about the fact that analytics today is focused on forensics, and the move is to make it actionable. Where you were to draw the classic bell curve, and where do you think we are in that process? Are we kind of like really at the very, very beginning? Are we starting to ascend in terms of having the tools available to make it easy for us to do that? Actionable.
I would say we're on the incline. We're certainly we're not over the tipping point. We're just starting. I mean, to the point of what Matt just mentioned about Adobe doing the automation part. As we start talking and hearing a lot about predictive learning, machine learning, AI, zettabytes of data are being processed by hell, right? IBM has opened up the supercomputer that everyone can go in and start hacking away. The tech and the servers are there, but we need data. And the data is there, so now it's being funneled in. The machine's going to start processing it. So I think where we are now as tools, it's being made available to us or easily accessible to us, are just kind of morphing in. And hopefully one day Adobe will make that service free, and that'd be awesome. But yeah.
We certainly think a lot about data. I mean,
Yep.
you hear big data thrown around a lot, but if data is not actionable, if you can't actually weave it into something that's of value or able to be actionable, it's not so useful. It's just a big pile of data. And so that's certainly something we think a lot about, as does Adobe and others. What else, you guys? Any other questions? Yeah, sure. Shoot.
I was wondering if anybody has experience with personal evaluation in non-e-commerce context, like public health is what I specialize in or have most background in. So behavior change, like getting people to eat healthier, evaluating that long-term from a website to an app to potentially increasing counseling.
Anyone? This was a long time. I already kind of alluded to Revolution Health before this job. We talked a lot about that, about how trackers, how can you help people understand where their health is and what they should do and take action from it. What was really interesting about it was at the time it was too early. It was 10 years ago. People really just didn't want to track their health. That's where I wanted to mention wearables has really changed that. And so now that we talked a little about that connection between the experience I have on a website to an app to the wearable device, and having that kind of experience that goes with me wherever I'm going, then I can go home and ties back to the digital experience. Is something that just wasn't possible, and now that it is, I think for things like health, is really fundamentally changing, and being able to actually change behavior, which is really exciting. I mean, it's
yeah,
pretty
and
neat.
to that thread, I think it's for that space, it's very important, even more to really like define your customer journey, like to really understand how are people tracking their health today, and if that's the device, like how can you get that data into your platform so that you can then help them make better decisions with food, or better decisions with like the way they're booking their doctor, or the information they're getting, and really like tying that whole service together. I think right now we have a lot of these like one-off silo like products that are coming out, but what would be interesting in the next phase is to see how the system all communicates together, right? Like my doctor and my medical records are not connected to my app, and they're not connected to my phone, you know? So it would be really interesting to see how that evolves and becomes more integrated.
There's no emotion in data. So like the tools there aren't made for what you're trying to do. And I think primary research, going back to what we were talking about, is very important in that regard of understanding why people are using these, or how it makes them, you know, what do you use the app for? What do you use it on the phone? How do you track, like you said? These are you can get a lot of that, I think, through just talking to the users of your product and learning how they intend to use it, or what they, you know, or how they don't use it.
Having done some work within NoVA, I ventured into the world of healthcare, which was kind of scary. And it's really scary. Data is very secured. It's very, very highly scrutinized. Insurance companies between healthcare providers are scrutinized over in terms of how data are being accessed just purely between the providers and also with the patients. So I think to answer your question, I think there's a huge opportunity there. Certainly there's a lot of technologies, a lot of companies, hardware companies even for that matter, start looking at the sensors. So be able to provide those type of data. I think the critical question is going to be, how is someone going to be able to make sense of that data and make it accessible to the doctors, to the patients, whether or not to be something that it's being monitored on you, to be able to be processed in a way that's a tangible sort of medical analysis that the doctors or the hospitals can act upon. I think that's probably the hardest next step for healthcare providers to be able to get over the barrier. I'm sure there's a lot of companies that are looking into that. I'm sure there's a lot of people here that probably could shed some light into the healthcare field. But that's something that I learned in that space, was that data security, and just making that accessible and something that you can act upon is extremely, extremely hard.
There was a statistic in the news recently that the third most common cause of death in the United States is medical error. After heart disease and the first one, which I forget, cancer. Always a fun topic. But yeah, medical error, it's a huge, huge problem. And that's where things like designing these threaded experiences across doctors and patients and care providers, medical records, and you know, wellness tracking and all that sort of stuff.
And if I remember correctly, it was medical error by virtue of transfer between doctors.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Like a handoff.
Yep.
Like
Incorrect
wrong
prescriptions, wrong,
And what's interesting too, a lot of these sensors, the cool tech you're thinking is going to help improve a patient's life, are considered as wellness initiatives rather than actually a true primary care initiative. So that's really interesting as they start thinking about embracing technology in a way that actually helps them to really help inform to make that decision. I think that's also another hurdle that I think a lot of hospital systems, insurance companies need to get over, and then also be able to remedy that on that. So.
Getting back to tools, how many people are familiar with customer journey maps, customer journey mapping? How many people have actually done one? Yeah, that's fair. Really powerful tool. I encourage you guys to look it up. Really briefly, the idea is you're looking at an experience of someone across across a brand experience. So the most common one is that I'm interacting with a railway train company. So the moment I book my ticket and I come to the station and I get on the train and I'm riding on the train and they're collecting my ticket and then I'm getting off the train and there's the follow-up email and that sort of stuff. So the entire journey of the customer across and what are the touch points that connect those dots together can be a really powerful tool to
And what's really fun too, when you start getting to the psychology and the cognitive aspect, look into moods. What is the happiness level of that particular individual? When they first start the experience, before you get a chance to fix the experience, and after the ideal experience of how you essentially be able to craft the experience to be a better experience.
And especially when you correlate it against what their expectations are.
Right. Yeah, that's great.
It's
Yeah.
like your disappointment factor.
Yeah.
How much do you let me down today?
Right.
Exactly.
What have you done for me lately?
A few more questions. David, go ahead.
I just want to follow up on that last comment question. The one, I guess, comment that I would make is, I think there's a commonality between what I think everyone here is doing in e-commerce and what you're trying to do. I don't even know if I can see you behind the wall there, but hi.
Sorry, hi.
No, it's okay. And I would not. And my recommendation is not to try to separate the product as something that's I'm doing something that's non-e-commerce and something that's e-commerce, because you're really trying to take someone, like you said, through a customer journey. You're trying to, in fact, sell something, whether it's a product or a service, or you're trying to get someone to take a certain action, whether it's, to buy something or to get them to do something that you want them to do to take care of themselves. So, define that action, and that action will get you to that success.
I can agree with that to an extent. I think there's a difference in the way people search for health information than any other information.
Yes, of course.
So it's a long conversation.
Yeah, I mean, there's a completely different journey, of course.
A lot of opportunity.
Babe, after we break, you guys can jam on that. Couple more questions and then we're going to wrap up here. Go ahead.
I think like right now, the software, the tools that are coming out for patients are not connected with the tools for doctors. But worse than that, the tools that doctors have are really behind. They're really terrible. Doctors struggle to use their own tools to manage healthcare. So it's even difficult to say how would I change a patient's behavior when their own doctor is struggling to manage the patient's behavior. So I would add that piece.
So I think later this year we need to do a panel on
Healthcare.
UX and healthcare.
Absolutely.
That would be a really cool topic. Yeah, that would be a fun one. Someone in the back has a question. All I see is a ghostly hand. Hello. Ooh.
Is it possible for a siloed organization to provide good user experience for their customers, or does that need to happen more internally first, as far as like onboarding and engagement, before something like that is implemented to external?
So to repeat the question, so for a more siloed organization, how can you do some of these things that we've been talking about, connecting the dot? Is it even possible?
That needs to be kind of solved internally first before you even venture out and try to provide a good user experience for your customers.
I love that.
Thoughts?
Yeah, actually, you can do it. And I think one thing you can do is instead of doing it in the silo, invite some of those folks that you think might be the necessary key stakeholders to come in and be part of the early stage sprint process and start thinking about it as a design sprint. I know technology-wise, we've talked about sprints, but you can also kind of apply some of the Google Venture design process of design sprints or just pure brainstorming to get saying, you know what, how can we make this experience better? Get some of the early buy-ins. Now, as a silo organization, then you'll have your internal resources to be able to start crafting using journey maps, crafting some prototypes, to be able to get some buy-in. So if your goal is to be able to build something, I don't know, what is the exact goal? Is it to improve an experience or to create a new experience, or is it, I mean, I think it all depends, right? I would say a great way is to get your key stakeholders involved. If you know that you're a silo, you need support from externally. You're a subsidiary and a part of a larger organization. Or is it more of I'm a department in a larger company, or is it? Okay. I would say user experience could be driven from any department. Which department are you in, like in terms of organization?
I mean, IT.
Okay, perfect place. Yeah, why not?
Yeah, maybe start small.
Yep.
Like say, hey, let's try an experiment with a few of us, and I'm going to reach out a little bit outside of those boundaries.
Because I would say everyone would want to have a better experience. I think it's hard to say no. I want a shitty experience, right? So I think everyone could be on board. It's like, yeah, I want good experience, right? So I think you can get some stakeholders and sort of some buy-ins across departments to be able to say, yeah, let's do some good stuff.
To add on to that, in addition to involving the stakeholders and getting them involved early and having their voices be heard, get buy-in, include your users as much as you can in those conversations as well. So when you're in those silos, it's easy to just see the silo walls around you and trudge through the day and look at the clock. Once you get the people inside those silos more connected with the end users, then they start to see what the influence of their actions are and how it connects into the larger picture.
Yep. And think about how you're going to measure it, right? Because then you say, hey, we did this experiment and we did this thing. And here's what happened. Here's the result that we had. And then you can look at it and say, wow, do we want to have more results like that? Well, that would be great. And all of a sudden now it doesn't have to be quite so small the next time. Yeah, sure.
Or wow, that really went badly. Yeah. But here's what we learned from it, and let's do it again and tweak these things and do it.
So you're increasingly giving yourself permission to change maybe the way things are siloed organically, in your case from within, but by kind of saying, well, maybe I'm going to pay attention to those silos quite so much. I'm going to invite these others, and you might be surprised that others are really excited to maybe reach outside of those silos too.
Yeah, and you brought up design sprint, and I would go. It's done by Google Ventures. I think they came up with the idea. I would go look it up, design sprint, and just Google design sprint. It'll come up, and that's the whole concept: is low entry to barrier to it's to understand if this is a product that we or an experience that is even worth making, and to help you get started, and you
start moving,
just going, and really quick. And just getting people from all across the organization involved, including the highest stakeholders, the people who can make a decision, and that's the decision that gets made, and people who are from all over the company. It's a really interesting. You should, if you haven't heard of it, Google Design Sprint. I believe the book just released, actually, as well.
Okay.
There's an important piece to note in the design sprint is that, especially when you're trying to get a lot of, you're trying to get siloed organizations feedback. You have a bunch of stakeholders, you got a lot of opinions, but you also need a lead and you need a decision maker from an experience design point of view. And you need sort of a person that can take that information and sort of process it and be able to possibly negotiate between some of the different silos that may not have the same opinion. So things may not, people may not always agree. I mean, there's things to be wary of when you get people together, especially at the high level.
I think that's where the users come in.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, it's the user's experience, not the stakeholders' experience.
But that's where the design lead has to be critical in explaining, you know, data is the, and data and the experienced design team makes the decisions here because of these types of.
Well, it's definitely part of the sprint too. Is testing. It's built into the actual process of.
I believe that's day 4, I think.
Yeah, it's like, okay, you're the stakeholder and you have the highest opinion. Whatever you want to make that decision, great. Let's take it. We're going to prototype it really quickly, just like we will my idea or your idea, anybody's. And we're going to go throw this at people to actually use it. Prototypes. It can be just drawn on a piece of paper or whatever it is. Really quickly, test the ideas, measure it, see if it's even worth making, and then you can actually prove it to them. Because actually doing that and putting it in front of somebody is much more powerful than telling them, I have experience, you know, like I'm trying to talk to them without the user data, like we're talking.
Well, that's what I mean.
Yeah, yeah.
This is the way that
Yep.
you do it.
Yeah,
instead
exactly.
of having-
Yep.
Exactly.
And if you can get executive stakeholders in user testing, you will be shocked how quickly changes suddenly
yes.
become possible. Because like, what do you mean they couldn't do that? Okay, to wrap this up really quickly, in just a few words. What do you guys either think is the most exciting part about kind of the things that we've been talking about here, and or what do you guys think is kind of the biggest challenge or biggest hurdle? Kind of final thoughts. Starting with you, Alex.
I think we touched on it. I think as designers, and I think as disciplines in the UX field, to be technologists, to be researchers, to be UX designers or creatives, is that you're actually going to start touching a lot more stuff. You think back in the days, designing 800 by 600 was tough. Now we're dealing with what? Tablets, phones, Androids, iPhones, the 4s to the 6S's and goddamn 7's coming out. You start thinking, right, that's not going to change. In fact, you're going to continuously get more devices. You're going to get more touch points. If we start talking about cross-channel, conversational UX, how are you going to start doing conversations? How are you going to start creating and crafting experience in augmented reality to virtual reality? That's probably 3-4 years down the road. Tech is still catching up. But you start thinking about how humans interface with information, there's going to be a hell of a lot more touch points. And I think that's what excites me as we start thinking about things that we impact, things that we could do, is beyond just the window. As we start thinking about hardware, as we start thinking about healthcare and sensors and so forth. I mean, it's a lot. And I think the field of UX is going to continue to grow. And I think we've all seen it easily in the last 5 or 6 years. For me, seeing it growing for the last 16 years has been really, really incredible. So I'm really excited. And I also think that as we start getting immersed into the experience, we start thinking about the possibilities. As we start thinking about cross-platform design and so forth, we talked about brand and style guides. I think really this is where we start thinking about, it's not just as a brand, but almost you start thinking about as a manifesto or start thinking about as a culture guide. Apple, Steve Jobs said, think different. That drove the entire company. We started thinking about Netflix. It was about their culture guide. It's not about you, it's about the company. Sorry, you're fired, right? So you start thinking about as a higher holistic level, it's weird. Uber says Atom design. Well, it's in some ways, we're kind of doing a lot. We're touching a lot of the human psyche and kind of what they do every day. And some are a lot more important than others. Healthcare versus when's my next date on Tinder. So it's pretty exciting.
All right. Anybody else? Final thoughts?
Yeah, I
Brooke,
mean,
what else?
add this as well. Like we have, in looking at the journey, we see areas where we can start to touch our users, but we don't have necessarily the application to do that yet. So what can we do? And maybe that lends itself to creating a mobile app so that we can send notifications right to your pocket, right? More and more people have phones, and so they're spending less time at their desktop and then more on the phone. So how can we change the conversation over to mobile devices so that we're a lot more connected in that way? So yeah, definitely a lot of challenges and interesting opportunities.
And watches.
And watches.
Brooke, any final thoughts?
I guess one thing that I wanted to raise or think about is reducing the how often we're asking people to cross channels and designing like whole experiences on certain, let's say, devices, for example. WeddingWire used to ask people via email to go to our desktop site to write a review, and we experimented with, well, maybe they could just write their review in the email and submit it that way. And I think that could happen all over, just because in the past we've resorted to, or we had people travel across from email to desktop. Maybe there's a way to eliminate that step, and maybe that increases conversion. And the same could be said for mobile devices. I think that it's a challenge. There's tons and tons of limitations of mobile devices, but if we can overcome those and create experiences, like amazing user experiences on the mobile device, that will create some of this back and forth. It reduces the amount of tracking that we have to do across the different devices. I think there's some benefits to doing that. And it's really exciting to think, okay, well, can we start designing for your smartwatch, and maybe your smartwatch doesn't have to be tethered to your mobile phone anymore. It can start living on its own, and things like that. So I think that that's maybe one school of thought and one prediction for the future.
Interesting. Bring the context to them instead of making them go to the context. Very
Yeah.
cool. Guys, any final thoughts?
For me, it's, just in the more of it, it's the data sharing between the channels and figuring that out. What's the post-cookie world look like in terms of tracking? A lot of marketing stuff. Everything from geolocation and how people react in different areas. We're moving, a big project right now is moving away from that big bulk email or big segments of email sending and moving over to everything towards triggered emails based upon your actions that you take. So setting up big filter, they're like big rule sets and triggers. The same thing with like notification systems and how you notify people on devices or on desktop even or on web. What are those rule sets and how do they build into the systems that we have from a shopping perspective? Like, hey, you made a purchase order, you abandoned, you left, and that triggers off a push notification like 10 hours from now that says, hey, we saw you leave or something, and you have this in your cart. And here, by the way, take 10% off of that if you want to buy it right now. Like the ideas of my mind just goes crazy when I start thinking about how granular those things can get, and then you have to pull it back up. Because it's, and how you manage that over time is just, it's a challenge, and I love that challenge.
Yeah. Hoby?
I'll be quick. I think the most exciting but also challenge for us right now at CustomInk is more about the people and seeing the shift in how the people who are doing the work are evolving and that different relationships are forming, and people are talking to each other differently and realizing that they need each other and that it affects the work that goes out. In addition to a bunch of inkers that I work with, tonight I'm joined by a new vice president of creative and a new vice president of user experience, and having leadership put a stake in the ground and say these are things that are important to us and we need leadership in these areas. And having those guys here tonight and present and accounted for is something that wouldn't have happened a couple months ago or a year ago. So that's
true.
Stoked about that.
Kudos. So we've covered a ton of ground tonight. A couple last minute things, and then we'll be around. Thank you for your patience. We've kind of really gone broad and deep this evening. So I want to thank the whole panel here, guys. Thank you so much for coming and talking with us.